We as a church are journeying through the book of Revelation in a series called Revelation, God's Message of Love, Hope, and Waiting. And we are in week 2 of a 7-week series where we are looking at 7 real churches that Jesus addresses. And he has, all these churches have something that they are commended for, something they are critiqued for. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. And what we're doing is we're seeing what Jesus says to them, but more so, we're saying if we were to get a letter from Jesus, if Jesus was to say to the church in Clarksville, Awaken Church, what would God say to us? What would he critique us for? What would he commend us for? But even more so individually, because I think that's easy to be like, oh, this is for the church. What would he say to us? Would he commend us for? What would he critique us for? So if you have a Bible, we're looking at the church in Smyrna today, Revelation chapter 2. We're going to be looking at verses 8 through 11 today. And if you don't have a Bible, you probably brought your smartphone with you. And I would encourage you, if you haven't already, download the YouVersion Bible app. And there you will see at the bottom, you'll see more. You click on that. You'll see events, click that. Awaken Church is right there at the top. You'll be able to follow along. And we do have a place. You can write your questions there. And like they talked about in announcements, we've got a podcast going on where you guys tell us what we're going to cover, questions that you have, things you want to know a little bit more about, and continue to give us feedback on that so we know that it's helpful and that it's helping you all where you're at as you dive into this as well. But the title of today's message, if you're taking notes, is Following Jesus Will Feel Like an Away Game. Following Jesus will feel like an away game. And some of you are like, what in the world do you mean? Well, let me explain what I mean by that. The year was 2007. And if you're like my kids, anytime I start to tell a story of like when I was a kid or when I was younger, they all roll their eyes and they all go, here we go again, you know? So I'm going to indulge you guys. So the year was 2007 and we all say, here we go again, right? Jen and I, we were 2 weeks away or so from getting married, and my parents gifted us with a trip to New York City for our honeymoon. And so we were excited about this. We were making all the plans, and what are we going to do? What are we going to see? And one of the things that we got, so next to getting married, this was the next thing I was excited about, is I got to go to Yankee Stadium, old Yankee Stadium, right? Yep. That's right. No, okay, all of you, be quiet for just a second. This is, like, I grew up a Yankees fan. That's like going to church, all right? Like, I was so excited to go there. So, Yankee fans, let me hear it. Everybody else? Yankee fans have it. So, if you don't know baseball, we were going to Yankee Stadium. We were going to see a Red Sox-Yankee game. Like that's right, yep. Cream of the crop, because if you don't know baseball, this is essentially a rivalry. Like there is not a lot of love for either side. Like the Yankee fans do not like Red Sox fans do not like Yankee fans. If you're here at church, we can get along. We can learn love to one another, you know, but there's not a lot of love for them. And so while we're getting ready, Jen kind of goes, well, you know what? I think I'm going to wear my Boston stuff to Yankee Stadium. And I looked at her and I was like, that's not a good idea. Like, you probably don't want to do that. Like, you shouldn't do that. And so I had to explain to her why this would be a bad idea of doing that. And so she ended up finding a Yankees hat. She wore that. We were all good. But while we were taking the train into Yankee Stadium, there were Red Sox fans in that train. And there were, of course, Yankee fans. And the things that they were saying to one another, the way that they were acting out was impressive. And we get to our seats, and I have Yankee fans in front of me, Red Sox fans behind me, and they're just yelling at each other. Even when we're getting concessions, like in the big concourse that they had there, they're saying like things I can't say in the house of the Lord. Like I didn't even know those sentences. Those words were even bad words, but they were stringing things together, saying stuff to each other. I think it was the 7th inning. I remember I looked up, and all the way at the top, I saw a Yankee fan and a Red Sox fan, because they're wearing their colors, falling down these cement stairs, fighting one another, and then seeing security run up there and trying to break the whole thing up. Get back to the hotel, I said, Jen, aren't you glad you didn't wear the Red Sox stuff? And she said, yes, I am. She was very excited not to do that. But here's the point. Here's the reason why I share that with you. Because following Jesus will be like wearing Red Sox gear to Yankee Stadium. Following Jesus will feel like an away game. We aren't people who are called to blend in. We are to stand out because we are followers of Jesus. Jesus even said in John chapter 15, he said, remember what I told you, a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. Jesus told us that we should expect heat for our faith in him because we're not of this world. The church in Smyrna was facing persecution. They were suffering. It was like they were wearing Red Sox gear to Yankee Stadium. But Jesus, he is praising this church, these people, for their persecution and the suffering that they are going through. So let's look at this letter. What Jesus says to this church in Smyrna, it's actually the shortest letter to the church, so we could call it a postcard to the church in Smyrna. That's kind of what it is here. But look at what Jesus says. Verse 8, it says, and to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and slanderers of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. There are only two churches in the book of Revelation where Jesus has no critiques for them. It's this church in Smyrna, and it's a church that we're going to get to in a couple of weeks, the church in Philadelphia. Now, you probably don't want to know the reason why there's no critiques, because you're not going to like the reason why. I didn't like the reason why. But the reason why there are no critiques for this church or the one in Philadelphia is because they are suffering. Suffering churches are the strongest churches. This is true globally, historically, and biblically. Suffering churches are the strongest churches. Why is it? Because it does two things for the church. It purifies it and it unifies it. It purifies it and it unifies it. When there is suffering in the church, there will be people who will be like, hey, peace out. It's been fun. See you later. I'm out of here. It purifies the church. I think we saw this in 2020. There were people who, when 2020 hit, there were people who were like, hey, I'm just checking the box. I'm out. See you later. I'm gone. It purified the church. I hear about stories of pastors in California and across the nation who are like, I don't know where all the people went. It's because when times got hard, the people left. I remember I bumped into people eating out at restaurants or going to the city forum. And I would bump into people and they're like, well, we'll get to church, but this whole pandemic thing, we don't want to be in a space with a lot of people. I'm like, we're in a restaurant. Like, we're in the city forum. Like, there's a lot of people. There's a lot of germs. Like, but here's the thing. We're all just checking the box. Got it done. It purifies the church. But it also unifies the church. It unifies. When there's suffering, it unifies us against the common enemy. Now, before we look at this church in Smyrna, it's important for us to have some background information, some context to really understand what Jesus is saying. We need to understand who these people are so that it can help us today as we're reading it. Because, again, we've been talking about this. The book of Revelation is not just there for us to get knowledge and experience, though it is there. We'll gain some knowledge, we'll gain some experience about what end times look like, what all of that is, but it's meant to help us endure today. It's to help us where we're at. So we need to understand the church in Smyrna so that we can understand how we can endure today. Smyrna, it was a port city. It was about 35 miles north from the church we looked at last week, Ephesus. And you could kind of think of Ephesus and Smyrna as kind of like Nashville to Clarksville distance-wise. It's kind of how far apart they are. Smyrna was also a wealthy port city because they were famous for their myrrh production. And you could kind of hear it in the word, right? Myrrh, Smyrna. So they were famous for. They were famous for their myrrh production. And myrrh is a flower that when it's crushed, there's this oil or this fragrance that comes from it. It's kind of like the first essential oil. Some of you are like, wait, what? Essential oils? Like you have my attention, But it was the first kind of essential oil there. And it was used for embalming bodies. Now, this flower, when it was crushed, it had a beautiful fragrance and aroma that came from it, but it only came when it was crushed. And this is kind of a cool parallel that I see. This one's for free, all right? The church in Smyrna, it was being crushed, but it was beautiful. It was pleasing to the Lord. But it only happened when it was crushed. It's kind of a cool parallel of what they're known for and what this church is going through. It was also home to a lot of famous people. It was home to Homer, not Homer Simpson, but Homer who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. It was also famous to a guy named Polycarp. Now, some of you probably never heard of Polycarp before, but Polycarp was a disciple of John. He was kind of the first bishop, first pastor of Smyrna. Smyrna was also called the second city, which just means that it was the second best city in all of Asia Minor. Ephesus was the best city. Smyrna, so Ephesus is kind of like Nashville. Smyrna was the second best. It was kind of like Memphis. It just kind of size and all of that kind of stuff. But you kind of see what we're going for. Smyrna was also famous for their worship of many gods, more particular, their worship of a goddess named Dionysus. Dionysus, she was the goddess of wine and partying. So you could just see, this is a big city, crazy environment, wild things going on. And in the midst of this rich, big, crazy environment, here's this church, and they were suffering because of their faithfulness to Jesus, because they believed in him. But even though they were suffering, they were being praised for it by Jesus. And there's three simple statements that Jesus says to this church in Smyrna. In the midst of their suffering, Jesus wants to bring them some encouragement. And Jesus looks at this suffering church in Smyrna and he says, I am, I know, and I will give. To these suffering people that are going through it, he just says, I am, I know, and I will give. So let's look at those three statements. The first one is, I am. When Jesus begins each letter to the church, he kind of gives a little profile of himself, and he tells the church who he is and what he does. So what does he tell the church in Smyrna? Well, verse 8. And to the angel of the church at Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last who died and came to life. What Jesus is doing here is he's saying, hey, this is who is talking to you, and this is who you are talking to. Jesus is like, I am the first, I am the last. I was dead, but I am alive. Basically, Jesus is saying, everything started in me, everything is moving towards me, and everything in between, it's all about me. It's all about Jesus. Jesus says, I am Genesis, I am Revelation. I was dead, I am alive, I am the Alpha, I am the Omega, I am the first, I am the last. And Jesus' words here are reminding the church that they have someone powerful in their corner. In other words, Jesus is saying, I am with you every step of the way, and I'm never going to change. I thought about that this week, and maybe it's because my kids, they're kind of all ending school here in the next month or so. And so, of course, everybody writes in the yearbook and all that kind of stuff, different things. And I was reminded of what was in my yearbook. My yearbook said, never change, Nate. Never change. Stay the same. Never change. It's weird, right? Because we change. If I was still, 12-year-old Nate, that'd be kind of weird. At times, my wife might say I am, but that would be kind of weird, right? Like if I still say 12-year-old Nate, we change. Jesus never changes. He's always the same. And he's telling the suffering church, hey, you have someone powerful in your corner. And I think we need to be reminded of this too. Because Smyrna isn't the only one to ever have experienced suffering. Some of you right now are suffering. Whatever it is you are going through, listen to what Jesus says here. He's saying, hey, someone powerful is in your corner. You have the first and the last in your corner. The Alpha and the Omega in your corner. You have the one who is dead and alive in your corner. Smyrna needed to hear this. And some of us need to be reminded of this too in the midst of our suffering. Whenever pain comes, whenever we suffer, we have a choice, no matter the cause of it, whether it's persecution, physical suffering, we have a choice, a fork in the road of what we're going to do when suffering comes. We will either become a better person because of it, or we will become a bitter person because of it. When suffering happens, we'll either become better or we will become bitter. We can allow pain to be the chisel to shape us, or a heavy stone that we wear that will crush us and make us bitter forever. We've met both kinds of people too. We've met people who've been more refined through their suffering, and we've met people who just get angry, bitter, and never release it. Pain is inevitable. Misery is optional. And what Jesus says to this church is, hey, be faithful. Be faithful, even to death. One of the privileges that I have here as your pastor is not only do I get to teach God's word to you, but you also have trusted your story of suffering to me. I've sat across the table from some of you, and you've talked about death in the family, death in friendships, broken relationships, broken marriages, broken relationships with kids who've walked away from the Lord, parents decaying or deteriorating, not decaying, deteriorating. That's a whole other thing. That's weird. Nobody shared that, okay, just so we're on the same page. Parents deteriorating, that's it. And how painful it is to see all those things. Unemployment happen. And I've sat across the table from many of you, and you shared your story of suffering, and I have seen you become more refined through your suffering, through the pain. I've seen you make that choice. I'm not going to become bitter. I'm going to become better. I've watched you be faithful in the midst of it. So when we think about the suffering in our lives, the suffering in our world, what we need to hear and be reminded of are those words, I am. I am. Jesus says, I am the first, I am the last. I was dead, and now I'm alive. Here's the second thing he says. He says, I know. Verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Now, there are three things that Jesus knows about when it comes to our suffering. And I don't know if you caught it or not, but the three things are, he knows our tribulation, he knows our poverty, and he knows those who slander against us. When Jesus says, I know this, he's not communicating that he has information about what's happening in your life. Jesus isn't like, well, I checked social media and whew, you're really going through it right now. Sorry for that. He's not communicating that he just has information or background information about the situation that you're in. He's letting you know, hey, I'm with you. And he's saying, I've been there too. When you think about the life of Jesus, he's experienced tribulation. He's experienced poverty. He experienced slanders. He experienced what it was to be persecuted, to be betrayed. He experienced these things. That's what he's reminding that church in Smyrna about. And isn't it so comforting for us that we worship a God? Isn't it so soothing for us to know that we worship a God who is not like so far off that he's like, oh man, that's terrible, but he's gone through what we've gone through. He's familiar with our pain. He's familiar with what we feel and what we're going through. One of the things we do here at Awaken is we offer biblical counseling. And anytime somebody ask for biblical counseling, we'll always turn around and say, well, what is it you're going through? Because we just want to know how we can better counsel, better serve. And so, people write back, and what we try to do is we try to pair you with somebody who's gone through something similar. Because there's something so soothing, there's something so good to know that you are walking with people who've experienced God's presence and God's healing in the very same thing that you are walking through. Sometimes it's just helpful to know you are not the only one to experience the things you're experiencing. And so it brings us comfort horizontally, but it should bring us comfort knowing that Jesus has experienced what we've experienced. He's gone through what we have gone through. And so Jesus says to these suffering people, to bring them encouragement and comfort, he says, I know. But let's look closer at what they are suffering in. He first talks about tribulation. Now, tribulation, that word translated means pressure, persecution, pain, problems. The persecution that the whole first century church faced, the persecution that the church has faced for the last 2,000 years and still faces to this day, we're being persecuted because of our faith in Jesus. At this time, the Roman Empire had a standard greeting, and it was, Hail Caesar, Caesar is Lord. That's what they would say. Christians at this time drew incredible heat because they would not say this. They're like, no, Jesus is Lord. That's who we worship. We don't worship Caesar. We worship the Lord. These believers were crazy enough to say, you know what, this emperor, man, he's got position, he's got authority, because the God who spoke, the God who made everything, put him in that position. That's why he has power and authority. But they're like, we don't worship the Caesar. We worship God alone. He's the one that we worship. He's worthy of our praise. They were being persecuted because of this. And for us today, if we want to be praised by Jesus for something, we need to ask ourselves, who do you profess to be Lord? Who do you worship? Because here's the thing. If you were to walk down the street here in the South, and you're going to ask 10 people, who's Lord? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say Jesus is Lord. Why? Because they've had an encounter in some capacity. Maybe grew up in church. Maybe they got baptized in the church. You know, maybe they went to youth camp, gave a couple times to church, whatever it is. And they're like, well, of course, Jesus is Lord. But listen, your profession of faith in the South can't be made with your lips. It can only be shown in your life. If you want to know who the Lord of your life is, if you want to know who you worship, you need to take a profess test. And you're like, what's a profess test? Kind of sounds like it rhymes, kind of cool, right? A profess test is just a cool way for you to be able to give yourself checkups to make sure that you are following the Lord, that what you say is being lived out in your life. And so we've got them up here on the screen. You can take a picture of it. You can write it down if you want. You don't need to answer these out loud. But from time to time in your life, ask yourself these questions. What are you most passionate about? Where do you spend most of your time and money? What do you get loudest about? What gets you angriest? Who or what do you listen to the most? And what do you cling to in times of crisis? This professed test will reveal to you what you say with your lips, who your Lord is. Who you say you worship will be revealed right here. And by the grace of God, may we all live lives that boom, that shout, that sing, Jesus is Lord. And if it doesn't, well, you just look at this list and you'll see. You go, that needs to change. That needs to change. And change it. Make the Lord the one that you worship in your life. So Jesus says, I know your tribulation, but he says he also knows about your poverty. Following Jesus affected this church in Smyrna financially. They're in poverty, and they're not poor because they're poor. They're poor because they're following Jesus. Now, we don't know all the reasons why they're poor. Maybe the government was, had their thumb down on them, was just really making it hard for them to live, maybe charging them more for stuff, making it hard for them to have a business, making it where you don't buy things from them or they can't buy things. We don't know all the reasons why they are poor, but all we know is that they were poor because they were following Jesus. Now, here's the thing. Obviously, everyone who follows Jesus isn't going to be poor. But everyone who follows Jesus, financially speaking, will have their finances affected. Or as Jesus would say, there is a cost to following him. Take up your cross. Deny yourself. Follow him. When it comes to our finances, our money, our faith shows up in our budgets. Again, you want to know who you worship, who the Lord of your life is, who you trust the most? Well, look at your budget and you'll find out. Following Jesus will affect your finances. Why? Because you can't meet Jesus and have any part of your life stay the same. Think about that for just a second. You were confronted with the truth of who Jesus is. You saw your sinful nature and you were like, man, I'm not going to curse. I'm not going to smoke. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to look at pornography anymore. I'm not going to do any of those things. When you encountered Jesus, you turned from your sins and you turned to Jesus. Your life wasn't the same. You can't meet Jesus and have any part of your life stay the same. So let's talk about finances for just a second. If you say that I'm going to give 10% of my hard-earned money to God's purposes in this world, but then you look at someone who makes the exact same amount as you do, and they're not a believer, and you're trying to live off of 90%, you're going to quickly realize, I can't live the same way that they do. Because you've already decided that 10% of your money is going to God's kingdom. So the world would say you're already behind. And this affects us in a lot of ways. It affects the cars that we drive, the house that we buy, how many times we can go out for coffee, how many times we can go out to eat, the clothes that we wear. The list could go on and on and on and on. Following Jesus will affect your finances because you can't meet Jesus and have any part of your life stay the same. There is no such thing as costless Christianity. I'm not talking about finances. There's no such thing as a costless Christianity. Now, we do not believe in the prosperity gospel, and we do not believe in the poverty gospel. The prosperity gospel says the more God loves you, the wealthier you'll be. The poverty gospel says the poorer you are, the more God loves you. There is no inherent value in being rich or poor. In fact, do you notice what Jesus says? He says, I know your poverty, but you're rich. We read that and we go, wait, what are you talking about? Because you can't be poor and rich at the same time unless there are different types of poverty and different types of riches. There's 4 types of people in this world. There are those who are financially rich and spiritually poor. Financially rich, spiritually poor. Now, in my opinion, this is what I believe, is that this is most Americans. Because when our physical, social, emotional, temporal needs are met, it's hard for us to feel our spiritual needs. So they're financially rich and spiritually poor. But then there are people who are financially rich and also spiritually rich. I think this is a small group of Christians. We're all called to be generous, right? We're all called to do that. But I think that this is a small group of Christians who are like, man, the Lord has blessed me, and I'm just trying to further God's kingdom. I'm trying to get the gospel out to as many people. I'm not trying to build my wealth, my business, whatever it is, my kingdom here on earth. I'm trying to promote God's kingdom. And so there are those people who are financially rich and spiritually rich. But then there are those who are financially poor and spiritually poor. I think that's a lot of us in the room today, right? Like we're giving 10%. And so we've already, in the world's eyes, we're trying to live off of 90% or even less. We're trying to build God's kingdom, so we're financially poor, but spiritually rich. But then there are those who are financially poor and spiritually poor. Now, who are those people? Those are everybody else who has not yet heard the gospel, the good news of Jesus. So what's Jesus getting at here? He's showing him that his value system is different from the world's value system. The world would look at us and our degrees and the letters behind our name, the money in the bank account, the cars, the house, the vacations, all those things. The world would stand up and applaud and say, good job. And Jesus would say, not so fast. Again, not that those things are bad things. Things can be good things. But Jesus would say, well, not so fast. Because you can be a wealthy poor man as well as a poor rich man. To the church that we're going to come to later on in Revelation chapter 3, the church in Laodicea, Jesus has something to say to them. Revelation chapter 3, verse 17, he says, you say I am rich, I have acquired wealth and do not need a thing. But you do not realize that you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. Yikes, right? I don't know about you, but I'd rather be the church in Smyrna than the church in Laodicea. I'd rather have the world against me than Jesus against me. So he knows our tribulation, he knows our poverty, but then he also knows about those who slander against us. Slander basically means to make false or damaging statements to hurt someone's reputation. You could kind of think of this as like cancel culture in the first century. These Christians in the first century were misunderstood. In fact, they had a lot of different names that they were called. Some of them, they were called atheists. And we hear that and we go, atheists? Like, why are they called atheists? Well, you got to think. In that culture, they worshiped many gods. But here are these Christians, they're like, no. We worship the one true God. So because they worshiped one God, they were looked at as atheists. They were also called cannibals. Strange, right? Like you're like, what, Jesus, wouldn't you have something to say against that? Like, where's that? Is that a hidden verse, But they were misunderstood. There was a misunderstanding when it came to communion. People would hear that they're taking communion. They're like, wait, you're eating people's bodies and you're drinking their blood? Like, that's gross. That's weird. What are you doing? You're cannibals. They were misunderstood. They didn't understand. No one's eating any blood, bodies, any blood, drinking any blood. Like, none of that's even happening. They were told that they were against the family because they used familial language to talk about being the family of God. They were told that they didn't like the government, that they were against the government. Christians aren't against government. We should pray for our leaders. Thursday, whether you're here, wherever you're at, take some time, pray for our leaders, pray for our nation. We should pray for our leaders. We want to live in peace. But listen, they don't worship Caesar. We don't worship Caesar. We don't worship the president. We don't worship any form of government, any kind of rulers. We worship Jesus alone. And so, as they were having names and their misunderstanding, we too have this today. There are many names, many things that we are called because there's a misunderstanding. But here's what John does. He sort of pulls back the veil and shows us who's behind the slander. In fact, look in verse 9, continuing in verse 9. It says, "And the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison." John uses both devil and Satan, two different names to describe the same person. He's telling them who's behind their slander, and it's Satan. Behind what looks like our enemy is our true enemy. Now, from the Christian perspective looking out, we have zero enemies except for Satan. When the Bible talks about our enemies, it's talking about people who don't like us. Well, what does the Bible tell us to do with people who don't like us? Does it tell us to go fight them out in the streets, go curse them, go shout at them, go yell at them? No. It says to love our enemies. The reason why we can have compassion on people who don't like us is because we see the enemy behind the enemy. We know who our true enemy is. These Christians in Smyrna, they were weird. They stood out because they were wearing Red Sox gear to Yankee Stadium. Jesus knows about our suffering. But not only does he know about the specifics when it comes to our suffering, but look at what it says in verse 10. It says that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Now that word 10 days does not mean a literal 10 days. And by the 11th day, they were good to go. I don't know about you, but I really wish Jesus worked like that. I wish Jesus would say, all right, Nate, you're going to suffer for the next 30 days. I'd be like, okay, by day 31, I'll be fine, right? So I get there, day 1, all right, we're down 1 day of suffering. Day 2, got another day down. Day 5, whew, that was a little bit tougher. Day 15, I see the light at the end of the tunnel, right? I wish Jesus gave us that information, but he doesn't. When he says 10 days here, Jesus is letting us know that our suffering has an expiration date. Suffering doesn't always last. Trouble doesn't always last. Pain doesn't always last. Suffering has an expiration date. And so Jesus says, hey, I know the tribulation. I know your poverty. I know the people that are slandering you. But he tells them, be faithful. Be faithful. He says, I am, I know, and the last thing he says is, I will give. Be faithful, and I will give. Verse 10, it says, be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. We as Awaken Church, we care about all suffering, especially eternal suffering. Jesus cares about all suffering, especially eternal suffering. And so what Jesus does here at the very end to the people who are about to face physical death, he tells them, don't worry, you're not going to be hurt by the second death. Well, what's the second death? That's spiritual death. Those in Smyrna, they're in persecution. They're about to face physical death. But Jesus is like, hey, you're only going to die once. And then they're going to be with Jesus for all of eternity. Unbelievers have another death to face. In fact, Revelation 20 talks all about this. It's a great white throne judgment, and there's a book called the Lamb's Book of Life, and there's names written in it. And if your name's not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, you are cast into the lake of fire. That's the second death. You're going to die. That's not a shock to any of us here today, right? At least it shouldn't be. You're going to die. Unless Jesus comes and raptures us, we're all going to die one day. But if you're a follower of Jesus today, you will only die once. Why die once? Because you were born twice. You've been born again. See, we all have physical birthdays, right? Mine's December 20th. We all have physical birthdays, the day we were born. But if you've come to know Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, you have a spiritual birthday as well. A day when you were born again. But if you haven't surrendered your life to Jesus, if you're not following him, you're still in your sins, you are an unbeliever, you will die twice. So we could say it this way: born twice, die once. Born once, die twice. The second death is to be feared more than the first death. But Jesus says to these suffering Christians that if we are faithful, he will give us the crown of life. Now, there's some people who will say, well, if you don't suffer well, then you're not going to experience eternity. That's not the case. When you turned your life from the Lord, when you received it, you got eternity. But this is a reward. There's different crowns all throughout the Bible that's talked about. But what's being talked about here is that if you endure, if you suffer, if you are faithful, there is a reward. God's going to give you something. It's the crown of life. In fact, in many Roman-controlled cities like Smyrna, there was an arena where athletic events would take place. And everyone in Smyrna knew about running races and winning crowns. And when you think about a crown, don't think about those heavy gold things that kings and queens wear on occasion. You need to think of these laurel leaves woven together. And again, it had great significance in the culture. And so what Jesus is doing here is he's taking something familiar in the culture and he's saying, hey, run the race. Endure the suffering. Be faithful, and I will give you the crown of life. But it's not a crown of laurel leaves. It's something that has so much more meaning and significance. Jesus is reminding the church in Smyrna, he's reminding us today that even though it may feel like our suffering is just going to go on and on and on and on and on and on, it won't. Our suffering has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. So be faithful, endure, and he will give us the crown of life. Jesus says to these Christians, I am, I know, and I will give. Following Jesus will feel like an away game. And this church in Smyrna was feeling it. They were being persecuted. They were weird. They were countercultural because of their faith in Jesus. Now, I understand right now this message, it may not really resonate with a lot of us because we're not in the exact same situation as this church in Smyrna is. As America, as the church in America, we're really not suffering. There's some hoops we got to jump through and stuff. We might be called some names and things like that. But we're not about to face death. We're not about to go through some of these things that they're going through. At least yet. There might be a day in our lifetime we might go through that. We might not. I don't know. But when that day comes, when we suffer, we will have a choice to make. Will we be like Smyrna or not? Awaken Church, by the grace of God, may we be just like this church in Smyrna. That when the heat is turned up, that we are being praised by Jesus because we are faithful in the midst of our persecution. Let me challenge you with this week. Even though we're not facing levels of persecution like this church is, can I just challenge you, as you pray before the Lord, would you just pray, would you add the persecution of the church in your prayers? This week I found out that 365 million people are being persecuted every year. That 1 in 7 are persecuted worldwide. In Africa, 1 in 5 are persecuted. 2 in 5 are persecuted in Asia. I even saw a map. It's kind of like a heat map of those who are being persecuted. And what kind of surprised me was that Mexico is getting persecuted pretty heavily. Believers there. In fact, I read this week that close to 5,000 people died because of their faith in Jesus. I think when we think about persecution, martyrdom, we go, well, that's something that happened a long time ago, not today. No, 5,000 people last year died because of their faith in Jesus. We don't know all of our brothers and sisters around the world who are going through persecution. We don't know their names, but it's happening. So this week, even on the National Day of Prayer, this week, would you just pray for those who are suffering, lost their jobs, threatened, their lives threatened, their families being hurt because they love Jesus. But let me personalize this for us today. Because for some of you, this message is for today. You are suffering. For others of you, this is one that's for the future, and you'll be glad that you heard it. But here's the thing. Sooner or later, pain comes. Sooner or later, loss comes. Sooner or later, suffering comes. And the time to get ready for suffering is now. We need each other before our lives or our world falls apart. We believe in this as a church. We have what's called Awaken groups, and we have a meeting all throughout the week. You can go online and check those out. We even have men's and women's groups that meet on Wednesday. We have a student group that meets on Wednesday, 6th grade to 12th grade. We have a men's group that meets on Saturday mornings as well. There's opportunity for you to get plugged in. They're going to continue all throughout summer, and then in the fall time, we plan on launching with more groups, with more people, more days of the week. Because we need to move from rows to circles. We need to make sure that when things happen, when our life, our world falls apart, we have each other. But not only do we need groups, but we need to be in this room together. Listen, I don't just come to church because I'm the pastor of this church. Now, that's a main reason why I come here. That's a big reason, right? But it's not the main reason why. I come to church because I need the people of God. I need you. There are times where I've sat in these rows and the suffering and the pain and the things that I was going through was so hard and so difficult that I couldn't even sing. I needed you. We sing the song. It's Waymaker, Miracle Worker, Promise Keeper, Light in the Darkness. You know that song? And then it goes like, even when I don't see it, you're working. Even when I don't feel it, you're working. You never stop. You all right? Do I need to? We can sing it. No, I'm just kidding. No. There were times where we would sing that song and we would get to those phrases and my eyes would ball up with tears because I couldn't sing it. Because what I was going through was so heavy. It was so hard. And in my suffering, I was like, I can't, the words were so convicting. I was like, I can't sing it. I can't say it. But I had your voices. And it helped me sing. There are times, like I said, where I'm either up here in the front or I'm in the back. And I know the pain. I know the suffering. I know the things that you are going through. And I see your hands lifted high. I hear you worshiping, and it encourages me. It helps me sing. I need your voices. I need your presence. We need each other so we can remain close to God. If you're suffering today, things may get worse, things may get better, things may stay the same. But here's what you need to know. The first and the last has been through it. He will go through it with you, and he will be there when you come out the other side. Even though we will suffer, let's be faithful. And just like the city that was known for crushing flowers, and when those flowers were crushed, a sweet fragrance would come from it. In our suffering, in our lives, even though we may be crushed, may there be a sweet fragrance that goes to Jesus from our lives. Amen?